Well, welcome all, whether you're watching later recording or joining us on Zoom. This is another panel discussion for talkaboutdoubts.com. Josh Tanis filling in for Justin, and I'll kick us off by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. Jonathan, we all know who you are, but briefly tell us who you are.
So my name is Jonathan McLatchie. I'm the founder of talkaboutdoubts.com. I am also an assistant professor of biology at a Christian liberal arts school based in Boston, Massachusetts, called Sattler College, which is an Anabaptist college. So I teach various courses. I teach freshman biology. I also teach genetics and genomics, microbiology, bioethics, anatomy and physiology. And I've been interested in apologetics for a long time. My primary areas of interest and research are, first of all, New Testament scholarship, the resurrection, that kind of thing. I'm also interested in Christology and the Trinity and Islam. And I also do a lot of work on intelligent design, which relates to my doctoral studies. And I'm a fellow of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thanks, Jonathan. Andrew, how about you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name's Andrew McNeill. I have a PhD in psychology, so I'm assistant professor in psychology at Northumbria University in Newcastle in England. I'm also a lay leader in my local church and actively involved in student ministry. And so talking to students about their doubts is something which I really enjoy doing, and trying to provide reasons to believe in Christ and to trust in the revelation that's given to us. I've known Jonathan for many years, and so it's my first time on the Q&A tonight, so it's a real privilege for me to be here, and so I look forward to the chat.
Thanks, Andrew. And Bethel.
Hi, I am Bethel McGrew. I have a PhD in mathematics, although I'm currently teaching high school at a small school in Michigan near Lansing. And I have gradually become involved in this world because both my parents are very involved in it, very active apologists and philosophers. So they've instilled that passion in me. So now I do a number of things. I'm a writer. I contribute to different outlets and have a newsletter, things like that. And so helping people with their doubts is something near to my heart, something that I hope I can contribute to in a small way.
Thanks, Bethel. Well, we have a number of pre-submitted questions. We'll get through as many as we can. A lot of them are big questions, so I'll try and summarize them. If you feel like I haven't been faithful to your question, please drop them again in the Discord chat. And if you want to continue, we're always available for calls. So one of the questions is a question about the death of Jesus and whether it's really a sacrifice. How can Jesus' death be a sacrifice truly if he just had to, lay down his life for a weekend? He knew he'd take it up again, and he's supposed to deal with sin, and yet we still deal with sin. There's a number of issues, related to that from the same questioner, but I think that's one fundamental part of this question. Is Jesus' death really a sacrifice?
Okay, so hopefully it's okay if I jump in. So my immediate thought when I hear that is it's still a sacrifice of suffering, right? So yes, he predicted his own resurrection so that he knew that the death would not be permanent, but he was still tortured, he was still humiliated. So that seems to me still very significant.
I think to what I would add to that is the fact that we've got to think in terms of the value of the sacrifice rather than in terms of quantity of suffering. Because when we think about it in terms of value, the person that dies on the cross is actually the Son of God himself, is actually God himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we find happening at the cross is a person of infinite value is actually undergoing death, the death that we deserved on our behalf, and experiencing the judgment that we deserved. And it's precisely because that value is so significant that this is a death which actually covers the world's guilt, and countless worlds' guilt, if there were other worlds. And so it's because of the significance of the value, then it covers every sin that could ever be committed. So that's what I would probably add to that. Any thoughts, Jonathan?
Yeah, we have reason to think from Scripture that God has chosen to accept Christ's death on the cross as the satisfaction that avails to atone for our sins. And since God is satisfied with Christ's death, us not knowing exactly all of the particulars of how that works out and why God deems that sufficient to satisfy his justice shouldn't, I think, be a particularly strong reason to abandon Christianity, or I don't think it should even deal a significant blow to Christianity. It's, I would argue, more of a question than it is an objection, unless one can show either that we do know the answer and it entails some sort of internal incoherence or is at odds with empirical data, or that we don't know the answer in a Christianity which we should expect. Short of that additional premise, it's only a question. And since Scripture informs us that God has chosen to deem that sufficient to cover our sins, I think that it's rational to trust that since God is maximally just, far more just than we are, and so we can trust it to God's judgment at that point, in view of the evidence that compels us to think that Christianity is in fact true.
A related question to the death and resurrection of Jesus is the question of how God could really make a plan of salvation that involved evil acts of man. The questioner says, how can God have Judas's betrayal of Jesus integral to the death and resurrection of Jesus? But there could be other questions like, why did God let the Sanhedrin have a kangaroo court? Why did he let the Romans do such a terrible thing? So how can God make such a plan that involves such grievous sins?
So I think, I think there are a couple of important things that have to be disentangled here. So the question may be, why did Jesus die in this way instead of an accidental death, maybe, or a natural death? Something like that. Like why would that death not have been enough to cover the sins of the world? And it does seem to me that kind of a death would still leave something out. That Jesus he wouldn't be suffering human injustice. He wouldn't be taking evil upon himself in the same way. But that said, it doesn't mean that God planned or arranged those things in the sense that that he approved of it, or that he made them do it. It's not as if Judas was a zombie, right? It's not as if the centurions or the Sanhedrin or any of the people who made wicked choices in the course of condemning and crucifying Jesus, all of those people still had their free will. So certainly God foresaw this. Certainly Jesus came knowing that this is how it was all going to play out, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't have done otherwise. And I mean, now that could open up a whole can of worms: Calvinism, Arminianism, Molinism, all that kind of stuff. I do think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, and so I don't want to open that can of worms either.
We'll leave that, yeah.
Exactly how free human decisions might fit into God's sovereign plan. But coming back to that basic point about God's sovereign plan, like why would God arrange in some way, or at least allow a world in which evil acts become part of the way in which redemption is accomplished? And it comes back, I think, to that basic question of, well, why does God allow evil as part of his plan in the first place? Why does he allow it? And I'm not convinced that there's like a massively satisfactory answer to that, except that it's plausible to say that God has sufficient reasons that we don't necessarily know about to allow evil, because he knows that it will bring about a greater good. And certainly that's what we see in the death of Jesus Christ, that an unspeakably evil act becomes the way in which God brings about the greater good of salvation available to all mankind. And so the problem of evil is always a real sticking point with Christianity, but I don't think it's an insoluble problem. And I'm sure you, Jonathan, you've got some thoughts on that.
No, I think that you both said it well. I don't really have much to add there. I think that God allows and permits evil in this world, but God in his sovereignty brings a greater good out of the suffering and evil that exists in this world, including the evil free will actions of individuals like Judas Iscariot, Pontius Pilate, and so forth. In the Old Testament, he even uses the wicked nations to do his bidding, even though they make their own volitional free will choices. You see the Assyrians, for example, in Isaiah 10, that God brings up against a godless nation and uses as the rod of his anger or the instrument of his judgment against Israel. And so even though these individuals are morally culpable and make their own free will choices, they nonetheless are used by God to achieve a greater outcome that brings about a greater good. And how exactly divine sovereignty and human free will work together, we just don't know. And so and there's a free will paradox really at the heart of any worldview, whether you be a Christian or an atheist. If you're an atheist, for example, or a naturalist, and you think that, which is essentially an entailment of naturalism, that the mind is reducible to the material components and constituents of the brain, then that really undercuts the basis for free agency or free will, and so it's very difficult to say that one is morally culpable for their actions. So there's a free will paradox if you're an atheist, as well as if you're a Christian, and so I don't think it should really move one in either direction.
A question that's also closely related to that is the idea about, if God's going to know that people are going to reject him, why is he going to create such people? Even if someone took a more radical approach and said God didn't even know for sure that was the case, it's still chancy. The questioner has an analogy of, if you know that it's likely, or you know for sure that your child is going to reject Christ and go to hell, that still seems like a morally problematic issue. That's even a fear I've had myself. But I think the heart of the question is, why would God create creatures that he either knew would reject him, or very likely some would reject him?
Okay, so the minute that you brought that question up, I went and I looked up an old article by my mom, and she called it the fallacy of the clickable universe. So to explain what she means by that, it's related to this question, because you could sort of go several steps back from that and ask, why did God make this world at all? Why did he create Adam and Eve, knowing that Adam and Eve were going to sin? So her answer to that, I think, is, you could give a similar answer to this question, because I think it's the wrong way to think about it, to imply that when God performs an act of creation, he's looking at like a computer desktop with a blue background, and all of the possibilities are laid out like icons. And then God takes his mouse and he clicks on one icon rather than another one. So then that whole universe with all of its history, or that person with all of his history, is fated to come into existence. But a more helpful way to think about it, I think, would be instead that people, again, by their free will, this is the free will thing again, people create the world's history as they go. The history of the world is made in part by people's free choices. So God makes the person, and then the person decides whether he's going to do X or Y. And it's the person who decides that, not God. So other people can contribute there, but it seems like that might be the beginning of the way to think about it.
I think that when it comes to questions of this nature, why God did it, permitted bad things to be present in the world, the answer has always got to be that God foresaw that through creating the world the way that he has, he could bring about some greater good. And so, yes, there are a lot of people that are going to reject the offer of grace that we are offered in Christ. But there's a great good that can come out of free will agency, for example. I mean, God hasn't created us as robots or automatons that behave in a prescribed or pre-programmed way. And so, unfortunately, a necessary consequence of creating that good thing, namely free agency, is that free agents will choose to reject God. On the other hand, there are also free agents that will choose to accept God's free gift. And so that is a good thing that can be brought out of that can be brought out of such a state of affairs. Andrew, anything to add there?
I mean, it is a tricky one, a really tricky one, which is why I didn't weigh in sooner, and I weigh in with trepidation. I would push back a little bit on the question and ask, is it unjust of God to create a creature who has free choices, and even if he knows they will do wrong and will incur condemnation, why does that make God culpable for what they do?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd push back on that question a little bit and say, yes, there's loose ends that we can't tie up, but it doesn't prove anything about God's injustice. And so that's why I would question that question a little bit. And I think what Jonathan says is true insofar as God does see greater goods. And we can't just reduce human beings to the bad things that they do. That even human beings who are ultimately condemned for their rejection of God and rejection of Christ still can do things which are useful in God's plans and which bring about good in this world. Mm-hmm. And so, as Jonathan says, that there's greater good that can be brought about. So again, it's the question of, is God unjust to do that? I don't think so, because ultimately people are condemned for what they do, and God isn't implicated in their choice of evil, I don't think.
And I think also we don't need to fully understand what goods God intends to bring out of the state of affairs that we observe. We have, in my judgment, very compelling reason to think Christianity is true, and that provides an indirect justification for thinking that God has some morally sufficient and just reason for why he's created the world the way he has, even if we don't understand why God has done it this way versus another way. So that's another point I would add.
The next question is, what's our best way to understand the state of the dead as they are right now? The questioner asks, are our spirits with Christ? And when the resurrection happens, it seems difficult to understand how those who are saved with Christ will suddenly have bodies when right now we have, when we die, when our souls are separated from our bodies, there's this invisible form we have, and then we have now we have bodies. That seems difficult for the questioner to understand. So how do we understand the state of the dead currently, and how is it that the saved will attain a glorified body on the last day?
So the Apostle Paul says that the dead are to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So there's still, in some sense, an experience of God, a presence with God. And there's a mystery there because, you know, in our embodied state, currently we experience everything physically. So it's difficult to imagine exactly what it might be like. Maybe, you know, dream states could provide a bit of a clue here, though. I mean, we've all had the experience of, you know, like you could have sworn that you had a dream where you woke up and made breakfast and walked around and even went to school. And then you wake up again and you realize, oh, wait, that was all a dream. And now you're in your actual body and you're actually waking up and making breakfast. So that was something that just occurred to me as maybe it would be a little bit like that in a way. And, you know, you can still experience things very vividly. So, you know, nothing will change in the sense of our joy in God, our experience of the beatific vision, that sort of thing. But that, yeah, there does seem to be something that changes, that the new bodies are granted only when the whole world ends. And that's a bit of a mystery, but, you know, not something that should trouble us too much, I don't think.
Right. I would absolutely reject soul sleep, which is an idea that the Jehovah's Witnesses have, and also many Christians have. Some people that are conditionalist, I would lean towards an annihilationist perspective on hell, though I'm not committal on the subject. But a lot of conditionalists would also take a soul sleep kind of perspective, that there is no conscious existence between death and the final resurrection for believers. And I would totally disagree with that. I think the evidence in Scripture is quite compelling that there is a conscious existence post-death and before the general resurrection. So, for example, in Revelation 6, it speaks about, or Revelation in verses 9 and 10, it says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. And another text would be in Luke 23, when Jesus says in verse 42 and 43, it says, so the thief on the cross and the criminal on the cross that is crucified beside Jesus says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, there are two ways of interpreting this text that are consistent with soul sleep, and I don't think either of them are very convincing. One of them is to say, well, really, you should put you should change the position of the comma. So really, it should say, truly I say to you this day, you'll be with me in paradise. But that construction is never found anywhere else in the Gospels, and so this would be the only place where that construction appears. So it seems to me to be implausible, certainly less plausible than the most face value reading is that the thief on the cross would be joining Jesus that very day in paradise. The other interpretation that Chris Date, for example, subscribes to is that Jesus was simply being pastoral with the criminal on the cross and saying that it will be as though it were today, because it will be like a blip or a split second between death and the general resurrection. That too, I think, is a bit of a stretch there. So I don't buy that interpretation. Another text that I think supports the idea of conscious existence post-death is in Luke 16, where you have the rich man and Lazarus. And of course, both the rich man and Lazarus die, and then they go to Hades, and the rich man is in torment. Of course, in the ancient Jewish mindset, they don't think about heaven and hell as two distinct places. Everyone goes to the same place, namely Hades or Sheol, the place of the dead. And what differs is the condition that one is in, whether one is suffering or in bliss. And the rich man and Lazarus is taken to Abraham's bosom and is in a state of bliss, whereas the rich man is in a state of torment, and they have a conversation or a dialogue. And the response typically is that, well, this is a parable. Well, yes, it is a parable, but parables are based on real world situations, not completely fictitious situations that are theologically inaccurate. So I think that also supports the idea of conscious continued existence between death and the general resurrection. And then at the time of the general resurrection, I would argue that the souls, the disembodied souls, will be reunited with their physical bodies. So that would be the position that I would take. Andrew, anything to add there?
I think I would pretty much agree with what you're saying, Jonathan. It's an interesting question because it's something that Christians do actually disagree over. And it's tied up with questions about the nature of human beings, theological anthropology. Are we dual beings with a body and a non-material part, soul, spirit, or are we necessarily embodied so that we can't think without a body? And our answer to those questions will determine how we then answer questions about the intermediate state. The surprising thing is that the Bible doesn't say an awful lot about the intermediate state. And Bethel's rightly pointed out that Paul's desire is to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. So clearly there is some sense in which the New Testament writers want to be with Christ, which will happen on death. And exactly what that state's like, I'm not sure I really know. Jonathan quoted from Revelation, and again, the visions of Revelation, I'm not sure are the best material to determine the intermediate state because they're apocalyptic visions. But certainly I think the passage in Luke 23 where the Lord says to the thief on the cross that he's going to be with him today in paradise, I think, that's pretty convincing. But as to the kind of state we will be in disembodied, that's very hard to imagine. And so I think Bethel's got the right idea when she's talking about this dreamlike state. It's hard to imagine what it would be like to be with Christ in a disembodied state. And so Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 5 when he talks about being found naked. And he recognizes that that's kind of an aversive state. So the Christian hope is consistently grounded not in life after death, but as Tom Wright puts it, life after death. It's the resurrection that's our ultimate hope. And questions about the intermediate state are all very interesting, but we just don't really have enough information and certainly don't have the kind of experiences to be able to talk in much depth about what that might actually be like. But certainly it's not the kind of question that's going to cause Christianity to rise or fall just because Christians have and do hold different perspectives on that, some of which are not necessarily terribly convincing, but I think there is scope for disagreement on that kind of issue.
All right, thank you. I'm reminded of Pascal's comment. He does say something similar to Joseph Butler's analogy of religion, where he says, if one is convinced by natural theology that God created life, then one shouldn't be overwhelmed with the idea that God could restore that life. The next question has to do with Matthew chapter 24. The questioner asks, what's the best interpretation when Jesus says, this generation? The question is of the timing of Jesus's return. Some say that this is fulfilled in AD 70, and there's a host of issues related to that question, questions that have been talked about by Bram Rawlings, who has, I think, some pretty good videos on that. And there's some books I've read that I found helpful, but I'll field it to the questioners. How do we understand Matthew chapter 24?
So the approach that I have come to, and I think there was a number of valid approaches here, but the one that I personally find to be the most plausible, and other panelists might have a different perspective, is I take a kind of a partial preterist view of Matthew 24, and would argue that the first part of the text, specifically verses 4 through 35, are referring to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the divine rejection of the Jewish nation. And then I would see from Matthew 24, verse 36, all the way through to Matthew 25, verse 46, as speaking of the final judgment. So just to look at the passage, we see in verses 1 and 2, it says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So that's, of course, unequivocally speaking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And then it says, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you who have wars and rumors of wars, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. And this is often misunderstood, by the way, by, in particular, the left behind theorists, because it's not saying that you will hear of, it's not saying that the wars and rumors of wars, is going to go on to talk about earthquakes and famines and so forth. It's not saying these are the signs of the end. It's saying these are not the signs of the end, right? Don't be alarmed by these things. You hear of wars and rumors of wars, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, if it's the end of the world, the mountains, fleeing to the mountains isn't really going to help you. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And so I would understand the saved here is saved in the salvific sense, that for the sake of God's elect, so that they don't fall away, the days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, and there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. I would argue that this verse, in verse 27, is a singular reference in this section to the second coming of the Son of Man. But then it continues in verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. In other words, don't be deceived by these false messiahs. When the Messiah returns for his second coming, it will be very clear. Mark my words. And in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the sun will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. I would argue that this is apocalyptic imagery, similar to what you see in passages in the Old Testament, like I believe it's in Isaiah 13, uses similar sorts of language. And it continues, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And literally, it's the tribes of the land will mourn. And so I would argue that this is the tribes of Israel that are mourning as the Son of Man comes in judgment, which is fulfilled in AD 70. And they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. Again, this is using apocalyptic language to describe the Son of Man coming in judgment against the Jewish people for the rejection of the Messiah with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels. Now, the word here is angelos, which can mean angelic, supernatural being, but it can also just simply refer to human messengers. And I think it's plausible that when it says he will send out his messengers with a loud trumpet call and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, that this is talking about the evangelists who are bringing in the Gentiles from the corners of the earth to recognize the Jewish Messiah, since the Jewish people have rejected their Messiah. And it says, from the fig tree learn its lesson, as soon as its branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gate. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And then in this text in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, you actually have two topics in view. You have the you have the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the sacking of Jerusalem and the rejection of Israel by God for the rejection of the Messiah. And then you also have the second coming in view, and that's what the focus turns to in verse 36, where it says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only, and so forth. So that's the perspective that I personally think is the most plausible, but there are other plausible approaches as well. And Bethel and Andrew might have different perspectives.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit less convinced by the symbolic reading of some of these verses. To me, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory strikes me as more straightforwardly a second coming text. I do agree with you that there is a mysterious intertwining of the earthly judgment and the final judgment here, and I don't pretend to have completely worked out how those are to be understood and disentangled. That's just my instinct, though, and I speak as somebody who hasn't delved too deeply into this here. I am curious, would you then also read Jesus' words at the trial? You will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and all that. Do you similarly read that as a temple destruction prophecy?
I think so. Yeah, I wouldn't
Okay.
be particularly dogmatic, but obviously Caiaphas, to whom he's speaking, is not going to be around at the time of the second coming.
Yeah. True. Okay, Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, this is obviously one of those instances where people will point to this and be like, okay, Jesus was wrong. He said that he would return in a single generation. Didn't happen. Ergo, Gospels are a bunch of rubbish. But I think, Jonathan offers a very plausible suggestion, and one which I would lean to. There's different options. The classic dispensationalist line is to equivocate on the meaning of the word generation. They would say it doesn't actually mean a generation, as in 25, 40 years, whatever. It actually means this kind of people will not disappear before Jesus returns again. So this kind of nation that rejects Jesus, that's the way it's going to be up until the end. I'm not particularly convinced by that. I think Jonathan's interpretation makes more sense, that basically Jesus is talking about two different things. He's talking about the events that lead up to his return, and he's talking about his return. And when he says that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, I take it that these things that he's talking about are the things that precede his coming and not his actual coming. And so I think he's saying that these things that he's described that lead up to his coming, they're going to take place in the generation that's currently there. And so you see that fulfilled in AD 70. As Bethel points out, there's a few issues with that in terms of reading some of the texts in ways that might not be instinctive, but I think that's certainly a very plausible reading of the text, and I don't think it's forcing it. Sorry.
Yeah, just looking at some of these earlier things, nation will rise against nation. There will be many false prophets. There will be many false messiahs, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved, and the gospel will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come, right? The end has a real sense of finality to it there, and the history that he's sketching out has a very vast sweep about it, it seems to me.
I would interpret standing firm to the end as standing firm even to the point of martyrdom.
Sure, right, and the disciples' martyrdom is yet a third strand in all this. I guess, we don't really know particularly about all the different false prophets and false messiahs. You see,
but there were a lot, right? There were a lot of would-be messianic claimants in the first century.
True, that is true, and you also see a little hint in Acts with is it Simon Magus, who's the guy who Simon something, the guy who's doing trickery and stuff. So he's a false figure. So he's maybe maybe there were a lot of people like that. So yeah, it's interesting. And obviously, right, when he says you're going to be persecuted and handed over to die, there's a concrete thing that did in fact happen to some of them.
Yeah, like I said, Bram Rawlings, I think, has done a number of videos in this I found helpful. A little book that he actually recommended that I found very helpful was this little commentary on Mark 13. It's free on Hoopla. If you have it, just need a library card. Jesus, the Temple, and the Coming Son of Man. Doesn't agree with N.T. Wright's interpretation, and I think he does a very good job. So I think that might be something worthwhile. Another book I'm making my way through is Ben Witherington's Jesus, Paul, and the End of the World. I haven't finished it yet, so no definitive opinion yet. All right. The next set of questions have to do with miracle claims, the filter that Tim McGrew has expanded on from John Douglas's The Criteria. So the next series of questions are going to be related to that, and especially to the alleged miracle claims of Sathya Sai Baba. All righty, let me pull it up here. All right, here we go. So the first series of questions has to do specifically with Sathya Sai Baba. He's a man he died in 2011, was worshipped as God. People claim that he had miracles. There's testimonies to these alleged miracles. And if we're going to say that his miracles are tricks, how do we know that Jesus's miracles weren't tricks? How do we disprove Sathya Sai Baba's miracle claims? And if they are just as if they're basically on par, how do we know it wasn't Jesus who was the false prophet, who wasn't the person who tricked folks? I have some notes on that I might be dropping later on the Discord chat on miracles, but I'm just offering this series of questions up to the panelists.
Yeah, I'm not up on Sai Baba in particular, but yeah, obviously here, this is where the filter that my dad was adapting there is very, very useful. So I came up with a cute acronym for it. I'm sure that Jonathan will remember it, but just all these different, what was that?
DOUBTS was the acronym. DOUBTS. DOUBTS.
Okay, excellent. So you know what, Jonathan, why don't you take it away and expand each letter there, because I didn't refresh this ahead of time.
Sure. So basically, the criterion was originally put forward by John Douglas, as Joshua mentioned, who has a book called The Criterion, written in the 1700s. And he put forward initially 3 criteria by which you could determine whether a miracle claim was at least worth investigating or not. There's a lot of religious miracle claims out there, and how do we know where to even begin? If you want to know whether God might have revealed himself through supernatural miracles, why ought we begin with the Christian miracles? Why not begin with some other religious claims? Well, the 3 criteria that he put forward were: number 1, if the events took place, if the first claims concerning the event took place a long way away geographically from where the event is supposed to have taken place, it's probably not worth your time investigating. Number 2, if the first claims concerning the supposed event take place much later, much longer, very long after the event is supposed to have taken place, then probably not worth your time investigating. And number 3, if the claim in question is confirming or confirmatory of beliefs already established. And so he points out that it's a lot easier to confirm beliefs already established by a miracle that might have been allowed to pass without examination in consequence of that than it is to establish a new set of principles and ideas and practices in view of a miracle. And so if it's confirmatory of beliefs already well established, then it might not be worth your time investigating. It's perhaps not the best place to start. And Tim McGrew subsequently expanded these criteria that he summarizes with the acronym DOUBTS. And so D stands for distance, I already elaborated on. E stands for opinions already established. The U is if the event is uncertain. It could have been something that people were plausibly, honestly mistaken about. T relates to the time since the event is supposed to have taken place, between the time the event is supposed to have taken place and the first claims concerning the event. And S stands for self-serving, in the sense that they are they perhaps grow the following of the miracle worker. So that's basically a summary of the doubts filter. Joshua, I know you're a big fan of John Douglas. Do you want to elaborate on anything I've said there?
Well, there's a questioner that has specific questions about the doubt criteria, every single one, and every 6 of the criteria. And so I think we'll get to that in a second. Specifically with Satya Sai Baba, I'm not pretending that I've read, everything on it, but the little I've read makes me think that he violates a number of these criteria, such as self-serving ends. There's a number of pretty reliable testimony that he molests boys. There's a number of evidence that he has his charities aren't as charitable as they could be, and the reason he gets away with a lot of this stuff is because another criteria, opinions already established. He has big government friends. He has friends in the police that he's friends with. They won't get him in trouble. And so, if Sai Baba was alive during the time of Jesus, he'd be friends with Pilate, basically. And the alleged miracles are very easily explained by magicians who replicate it. It doesn't matter that the sleeves rolled all the way up. It's very easy to palm pills of ash. And like I said, I'll drop more of this stuff in the notes, but there's just a number of things that make me think that he is a liar. He is surrounded by liars, very powerful ones. And the alleged, I haven't looked too much into this, but the alleged claims of resurrection come from a biography by Howard Murfitt. And Howard Murfitt also wrote a biography of Madame Blavatsky. And I think Murfitt's highly credulous because he also thinks that the magician's tricks of Blavatsky are convincing.
I think an important distinction between the miracles of Sai Baba and the miracles of Jesus, in particular the resurrection, is that Sai Baba's miracles are things that can easily have been concocted through a sleight of hand. They involve things like materializing watches and things of that nature, whereas and also there's no context of persecution. So how do we know that the claims concerning him are not embellished, etc.? So they're both. It's quite plausible that the claimants could be honestly mistaken, and it could be plausible that they embellished or are not being entirely truthful, because there's no context of persecution. Whereas in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, the supposed sightings of Jesus involve a multi-sensory experience. It's not just a brief sighting of Jesus at a great distance and very briefly or momentarily. Rather, it involves group conversations and group sightings and long extended discourses and eating with Jesus on more than one occasion, including an occasion when he cooked breakfast for them on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's extended across 40 days and so forth. And so I think they're just completely different categories.
Even the claim that Satya Sai Baba is an avatar of God, incarnation of God, is highly precedented in Hinduism and perennialism. But there's a lot more that could be said. Maybe I will put my sloppy set of notes in the Discord, because this has been talked about. The next series of questions has to do with the 6 criteria of doubt. So for example, starting with D, distance. So basically, how far is too far? Like at what point is the cutting off point? I mean, one initial thought I have is something that I hope Samuel Johnson said, but basically the idea is the difference between night and dark basically twilight does not eradicate the distinction between night and day. So even if we're not sure about some gray areas, this criteria is still helpful for weeding out something like the Buddha, whose biographies are written centuries later. What does the panelist make of the first one? How far is too far for the distance criteria?
I don't think there's a magic line in the sand, which I think it's more of a subjective thing. I mean, when we look at the claims that we find in the New Testament, we find that the earliest claims concerning Jesus' resurrection are extremely early. Probably 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 is the earliest source about the resurrection. And it's extremely early. Paul was writing probably around 53 AD, and he's most probably quoting a pre-Pauline oral creedal tradition. And so that goes back earlier still. We're not quite sure exactly how far back it goes, but it almost certainly predates Paul's own composition. And then, of course, you have the Gospels, and I think that the Gospels are written quite early. I recommend Jonathan Bernier's book, Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, if you want to beef up your knowledge of the early dating of the New Testament sources. But certainly the New Testament documents, I would argue, are almost all, if not all, composed prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. There may be one or two that are later, like the Gospel of John, perhaps, although or the Book of Revelation. Jonathan Bernier argues that even the Gospel of John is pre-70. He argues the entire New Testament, in fact, is pre-70. But we certainly have the New Testament composed within the generation of those who were witnesses of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Whereas with other miracle workers, you often have the first reports concerning their event, the supposed miracles, taking place many centuries after the event is supposed to have taken place. Anything to add there?
So just to clarify, you seem to be using distance in temporal terms. So is it spatial or temporal?
There's two that are different. Obviously, D is for distance and B is for belated reports. The questioner does have similar questions. How far is too far for distance? How long is too long for belated reports? So right. I think the answer could be similar. There's not a magic line in the sand, but there is a night and day difference in some instances.
And I think to clarify, I think I said T was time. I misremembered. T is actually for trivial, I think, in Tim's.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was confusing me a bit because I was thinking, okay, yeah, now that makes sense. So it makes sense.
This discussion about Sai Baba is kind of new to me. I hadn't really encountered him before, but this set of criterion makes sense. And I think one of Jonathan's contributions to my thinking is to think in terms of relative probability rather than thinking in absolute terms. And certainly when you apply these criteria in the sense of let's contrast the miracles of Jesus and the claims about Jesus' resurrection with claims of somebody else. And if you apply these criteria and think in terms of relative probability, then it actually helps you discriminate against claims, even if there's no cutoff points.
Yeah, the next criteria the questioner asked about is about opinions already established. And I think something similar could be said there as well. Like, how different do the opinions need to be? I think so. The relative probability is a good example. So, like Jesus in a Jewish monotheistic context, saying he is the Lord of Israel in the flesh, is very different from another Hindu guru saying, I'm yet another avatar. So that relative probability, I think, is very helpful, Andrew. The next criteria U is for uncertain events. John Douglas himself does mention this in the criteria. It's kind of the hidden fourth criteria, is if you have a naturalistic explanation that can have them explain things just as well, you should go for that. And he says, how do we disregard some miracles of certain events if people are certain they weren't done by natural means? And the example he gives us is of Satya Sai Baba rolling up his sleeve and showing, look, there's nothing up my sleeve. And yet he still does still produces the ash, the gold rings, a bunch of other things. I even watched a YouTube video of a pastor saying, this must be the work of demons because he has his sleeve rolled up. What do you all make of that?
Well, I mean, I will admit that there can be. I mean, sometimes there have been individual guys. I'm blanking on the name of this one guy, but he claimed that he could sort of telepathically control somebody's movements at a distance, right? Or whether somebody felt pressure on the back of their head. I don't remember how it all worked. Something. It was pretty creepy, not gonna lie. So my mom and I were watching it together, and mom was sort of speculating, maybe there is such a thing as the paranormal, maybe there is something that a person could sort of access in that sense that's not strictly materialistic, although it might still be naturalistic in a sense. So I mean, I don't know, there is weird stuff out there. I suspect with Sai Baba, probably you can explain everything just by good old-fashioned trickery and prestidigitation. That there's still a lot of that can be explained away in that way. But it is possible that if he was just a really bad guy, which it seems with these abuse allegations, a very plausible option, that maybe he was, among other things, also dabbling in some black magic. So that, I mean, I think that's always one possibility in the mix here. I do think people can have the capability to access that.
Yeah, I don't want to keep hijacking, but it seems to me that even with your sleeves rolled up, magicians are able to pretty easily replicate.
Yeah.
Like the ash is super easy, like having a pill in your palm. There's a reason he keeps moving his hand.
Yeah.
The gold comes from the bottom of trophies. It comes from a number of other things that happen. I saw, like, there's times where, like, he has the gold thing in the towel already when he spits it up, but there's other times where the Indian Rationalist Association, which is militantly atheist, but still is able to replicate, because the guy will
be useful in cases like this.
And later just tweet out and be like, oh, look, I produced this.
Yeah. It's similar to, I'm also thinking of the milk miracle. This statue that supposedly you could produce milk. I mean, like, we recreated that in our own kitchen just as a fun family experiment one time. So I mean, a lot of this stuff, there's nothing fancy going on.
Yeah, there's mentalist tricks that are sometimes, done by Darren Brown, but when people talk about Sati Sai Baba, when they do it, it's like, well, it sounds like the same thing. And I think in this case in particular, there's a lot of naturalistic explanations.
I think it may have been Darren Brown, actually, that I was trying to think of there, where I still don't have a great explanation for all of the different things that he does. He still spooks me out a little bit, but that's a tangent.
Yeah, but he admits, like, I'm just doing trickery, and we don't have to know exactly how he's doing the magician's trick.
Okay.
Like, he knows that he's doing this by non-occult forces. So anyway, my 2 cents. You have anything, Jonathan?
No, I think that that was a good summary.
The other criteria is trivial. So isn't this kind of a subjective criteria? While some people may scoff at the alleged miracles of these Indian gurus, for the people involved, this is really important. So how, like, is this really a subjective criteria? Because some people do find things that I might think is trivial, they may still find it significant.
Well, I think that the case for the resurrection is making the case that Jesus is the God of Israel incarnate, the Messiah of Israel, and so forth, and our salvation rests upon the veracity of the resurrection. And so it's by no means a trivial miracle, meaning that it doesn't really mean a trivial miracle doesn't really mean a great deal, even if it happened. And I would argue that the miracles of Sai Baba, or rather the supposed miracles of Sai Baba, are trivial in that sense. That, okay, even supposing they happened, okay, now what?
And I have to admit that there are some individual miracles, even in the Old Testament, where I do struggle to see their larger significance. I forget which prophet, if it's Elijah or Elisha. And so there's something about a pot of soup. And some people eat it and it makes their stomachs hurt. And they're talking about death in the pot or something. It's this whole big long thing in one of those Old Testament texts. And, it doesn't feel very important reading it. I'm just going to be honest. But yeah, when you're talking about Jesus and his incarnation and ministry and death and resurrection, there's no question that these things are of the utmost eternal significance.
I do want to add one thing to clarify, because one objection or concern that came up in Tim McGrew's debate with Zachary Moore at the Bible and Beer Consortium a few years ago, when Tim McGrew brought up the doubts criteria. The debate topic was, can it ever be rational to believe in miracles? And one of Zachary Moore's criticisms was that a lot of the Old Testament miracles don't fulfill the doubts criteria, and so are we going to therefore, to be consistent, reject the Old Testament miracles? But to clarify, we're not saying that if a miracle fails to pass the doubts filter, that thereby it didn't happen or that we've refuted it. Rather, we're saying that it can be reasonably doubted.
Right. So yeah, you do have to clarify necessary and sufficient conditions there. Yeah, exactly.
So it's basically a criteria to determine where would be a good place to start when you're investigating miracle. And of course, we have the argument from epistemic routing, when we have good reason to think that Jesus rose from the dead, and therefore that lends credence or plausibility to the other biblical miracles, even in the absence of direct evidence bearing on those individual miracles.
Andrew, again, I really liked what you said about dealing with probabilities, because I think trivial is actually useful. There's some gray areas. So for example, I think, what if someone did prove that the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot existed? I mean, I'd be like, cool, another thing in my zoology class. But this is not going to affect my soul. So I think Andrew's point is really, really important. Did you have anything else to add?
I don't actually have enough lot to add on that, but I think it's also helpful to think about in terms of not just, and I think Jonathan's already alluded to this, not just individual miracles, but think of the miracles as a whole of an individual, and think about their level of triviality overall. Because if you look at Jesus' miracles overall, and particularly the resurrection, then as Jonathan mentioned, that the significance of the resurrection and the non-triviality of that does then tend to add weight to other miracles. And the other point I would say is that there's just some miracles, even in the life of Jesus, that are not terribly important for us to actually demonstrate. So did Peter take a coin out of the mouth of a fish because Jesus told him to? Of course, I think so. But is that important for us to try and demonstrate as Christians? No, it's not actually. And so I think in that sense that we don't need to try and prove everything.
I do think, though, that one does want to be careful. One does want to be careful not to say, well, the little details don't really matter as long as we're clear on the big picture, because the small details are a part of a whole, and we would like to be able to rely on that whole confidently, holistically. So I would just interject that there.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's true. I think it's really just about the need for us as Christians to actually prove different aspects, or not necessarily prove, but to try and demonstrate the veracity of things which are of less importance in terms of the message that we're communicating. But I do see your point, Bethel.
Right. I think, to put it a bit differently, it would be fair to ask, let's suppose that we were trying to, meet Bart Ehrman halfway or something, go, well, let's suppose for the sake of the argument that Bart is right about X, Y, and Z, but he's still wrong about this thing over here. That's a slippery proposition, I think, because it could fairly be asked, well, if they got all of this stuff wrong, why should we trust them on the big picture, right?
Yeah, so no, I completely agree with you, and I don't think that we need to make concessions so much as saying that there's things that we don't need to spend a lot of time actually demonstrating.
I think another thing I would add is that we should be careful about saying things like, I believe say, the resurrection because of the evidence, and I believe in the virgin birth or some other aspects of the Gospels as a Christian, right? Michael
Yeah.
Lacona, for example, has said things.
William Lane Craig will say that.
William
Very
Lane Craig will say
unfortunate.
that. And I think that that's unhelpful, because as an evidentialist, I would argue that you are not rational in believing things except on the basis of evidence, at least contingent propositions, and that could be either true or false.
Yeah. What I think we can say, though, is that if once we have enough evidence that this is a generally reliable source, that covers a lot of specifics, and so one doesn't have to worry or fixate on any one in particular as far as trying to amass a positive case for that one specific thing, if we're confident enough in the general reliability. Right. Then it just sort of includes everything. Yeah.
There's an inductive argument. And also, since we have good grounds for thinking Jesus rose from the dead, that itself is greatly relevant to the prior probability or the intrinsic plausibility of other miracles in the gospel accounts, and indeed the Bible as a whole. And so that's what Lydia talks about as epistemic routing, which I think is a good phrase.
The rising tide lifting all boats, so to speak.
Exactly.
Those are very helpful points. Thank you.
The last criteria is selfish ends or self-serving miracles. The questioner asked, doesn't it seem like all miracles are self-serving in the sense that they're meant to bring followers to that individual? So how explicit does a gain need to be in order to disregard the miracle as self-serving?
I think, when I think of self-serving, I think about, material gain. Is it going to make the person more wealthy? Is it going to bring him greater sexual satisfaction? Is it going to increase his power in some very crude temporal sense? Is it going to happen at the expense of some other people who, some innocent person, right? Those are the kinds of things that I would reach for. I think it would be a misuse of the term to just apply it to getting a person to believe something if that something is actually true. That would seem to be a category error to me.
It seems that signs that point to the truth aren't necessarily self-serving. And even if one got something out of it as they follow Jesus, this is a significantly more altruistic path than I produced holy ash and I get political power.
Right.
I get charge of charities in India. I also get private sessions with little young men. And also this allows me power and prestige, and people wheel me out and tell me I'm God. So this is increasing the distance between Jesus and someone like Sakya Sai Baba.
Yeah, of course, though, there is the fundamental disanalogy here that Sai Baba was not, in fact, God. And if we're Christians, we believe Jesus was, in fact, God. And so, in some sense, you could say, sure, Jesus will say this was done that God might be glorified. And by the way, when I say God, I mean me, right? There are, with Lewis's trilemma, Jesus does say a number of things that would be extremely arrogant and dangerous for anyone who's not God to say. But it only works in Jesus' case because he actually is God. So we do also need to recognize that fundamental asymmetry there.
Anything else to add, Jonathan or Andrew?
No, I think Bethel did a good job. Andrew, anything?
Yeah, no, I think the psychologist in me thinks about that kind of criterion and thinks about the fact that, all motives revolve around ourselves to some extent. Like, even if we're doing something for something else, we'll always get some kind of pleasure out of that. And so it's never a case of like, either this serves me some purpose or it's entirely devoted to some other end. I think therefore it's really a case of who benefits from it. And if it's predominantly myself that benefits from it, as Bethel's pointed out, then it's a problem. But if other people are benefiting from it and you're gaining joy through that, then that's something different. Jesus says that the Father has given him eternal life, has given him authority over all flesh to give eternal life to all those that had been given to him. And this is kind of this grand claim that he's got authority over everybody, but what's he doing with it? Actually, it's so that he can give eternal life to everybody that's been given to him. And so that Jesus' claims are revolving around, yes, he's this very significant person, but he's doing it for the sake of the world. He's doing it for the sake of those that need salvation.
I have one more pre-submitted question. So drop your questions in the chat if you want. The last pre-submitted question has to do with the nature of how we get our resurrection bodies. The questioner asks, how is it, we have our souls, and then we suddenly get our Christian bodies back. But this seems to be a problem because there's bodies that are blown up in war, there's fires, cremations. I think Tertullian was asked this question about a cannibal eating a Christian who then the cannibal themselves converts. So how do believers that are dead or have their bodies dismembered or burned away, how do they return?
God reconstitutes them. How he does that, we don't know, but that's God's business.
Yeah, I don't really understand why this should be any more of an issue than literally every person whose body decomposes in a grave somewhere. I mean, it seems to be the same issue regardless. And then our new bodies are going to be new resurrection bodies that God provides, regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah. I guess the questioner would probably push and say, like, well, even the bodies in the grave, like, how are they made into the glorified body? I guess you could say, through analogy, we see that Jesus left an empty tomb behind, and we can trust his promises of our own future. But past that, it does seem kind of difficult to grasp how that process is done, or will be done, rather. Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a good question. But Paul deals with it in 1 Corinthians 15, and he probably doesn't give a satisfactory answer to the questioner, because Paul basically says that, we don't entirely know. That there is a kind of discontinuity between what's put into the ground and what rises again. And he draws the analogy between a seed that's sown and then it grows, and there is a discontinuity there. And there's also a continuity because the person that goes into the grave is the person that is resurrected again. It's just as Jesus went into the grave and his body actually rose out of that grave. How exactly that works, I do not know. And
there is a fascinating question, when God creates these new bodies for us, how closely do they resemble the bodies we had on earth? Certainly we believe that certain flaws won't be present there anymore. Deformities, sicknesses, all of that will be gone in the new resurrection. So they'll be upgraded in that sense, new and improved. But I don't see a reason to think that we wouldn't be recognizable to each other, right? I find it hard to imagine anything other than that. So, but like, will I still be short? I'm only 5'1". I would have liked to be taller while I was here on Earth, but yeah, maybe I'll still be 5'1" in heaven. I think I'm okay with that, but I probably won't have scoliosis in heaven. Put it that way.
Recall also that God raises the dry bones in Ezekiel 37. So there's an example in Scripture where God clothes these dry bones in that valley that Ezekiel looked upon with flesh and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's the thing with a lot of eschatology, Christian eschatology, how God will bring about the new creation is beyond our understanding, precisely because it's an intervention from outside of this natural world, and that has so many unknown factors associated with it. And we take it based upon the promises that God's given and the evidence of the resurrection, that Jesus rose in the middle of history, as a demonstration of the fact that one day it will happen at the end. But how that happens is anybody's guess. I'm going to have to shit on there, actually, to get my boys to bed, but I'll let you continue the conversation, and I really appreciate being on here this evening.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go in a few minutes here as well, sadly.
Well, thank you, Andrew. We do have one more question from the chat, and I think that will be the whole thing. So this is, speaking of the trilemma argument, can we use it to test others who claim deity, or is it just work for Jesus?
In principle, yes. So if someone claims divine status, I would argue that prima facie that provides justification for thinking that they are not honestly mistaken, because it's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about being the creator of the universe and the God of Israel incarnate. And so then the question moves to, okay, are they making it up? Are they lying? And in the case of Jesus, we have the fact that he was willing to get himself crucified on account of that claim to divine status. And that goes a long way towards establishing that he was at least sincere. And since he wasn't honestly mistaken, or at least is implausibly honestly mistaken, there's a very small reference class of individuals that could be honestly mistaken about being creator of the universe. And Jesus, based upon the information we have from the Gospels, doesn't seem to fit that reference class. And so given that he's not honestly mistaken, and given that he doesn't seem to be lying, given the fact he's willing to get himself crucified in an excruciating way, literally, that's what the word excruciating comes from, the Latin out of the cross, that I think moves the needle in the direction of his divine status. Bethel, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, some people will try and say, well, Joseph Smith allowed himself to be captured and imprisoned. And it's like, yeah, but he was counting on his small private army to come and break him out. And it's just that, you know, everything went wrong and he wound up dying in a shootout. Oops. So couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Anyway, so but by contrast, Jesus walked into a situation, Jesus had no private army. He even, I mean, the one little bit of resistance that Peter puts up, he says, no, stop that. That's not what we're doing here. Walks into a situation he cannot possibly get out of and sees it all the way through to the end. So yeah, I think the trilemma functions as an excellent filter in that way, a great way to just go systematically through these different people. And also, when you look at exactly what certain figures were or weren't claiming about themselves, like I was listening to Tom Holland, a British historian I like. He did a podcast series recently, well, just 2 episodes really, on the historical Jesus. And he sort of vaguely mentions a guy who briefly comes up in Tacitus, I think, who claimed to be some sort of divine figure or like a divine messenger or something. I went and I looked it up, and I mean, it is not nearly as explicit as the kind of claims that Jesus was making about himself. This guy, whatever he said exactly, yeah, he thought that he was very important. He thought that he was appointed by God or sent by God in some sense, but it's not the same thing as claiming to be God. And that's why things like the Tetragrammaton are important. You know, that's why it's important that we're very clear and specific on what exactly Jesus was claiming. Certainly, though, there are much vaguer things that somebody could claim while just being really arrogant or being a little crazy or that sort of thing.
Yeah. It seems to me that even if you're not a Christian, you can't help but think Jesus was an honest fanatic. But yeah. I think even if you grant very charitably the sufferings that Joseph Smith went through, there is overwhelming counter evidence that the man was a liar. Yeah. I won't get into that now, but
and he never claimed to be God either.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I think if people want to read into that, they should really look into Dan Vogel's work. So
talk about self-serving as well. I mean, Joseph Smith is like the epitome of self-serving.
Yep. All right, I'm going to head out here. This was
Well,
great.
that's all the questions. Thank you, Bethel. Thank you, Jonathan. Andrew, thank you for joining us. And if you have more questions, drop in the Discord, ask for a chat, and we'd be happy to help you. And if you find out wasn't satisfied with your questions, sorry, I'll try and deal with them on Discord or chats or anything like that. So thanks all for joining us.
All
Thanks
right,
for
thank
having
you.
me.
Bye, everyone.